morning. It is Thursday, September 11th, 2014. This is your morning edition on I-24 News. Coming up later today, 13 years after the worst terror attack in modern history, President Obama addresses the nation to outline the United States strategy to degrade and ultimately destroy the largest terror threat to the world, the Islamic State. An exclusive interview with Time magazine political columnist Joe Klein, looking at what, if anything, has changed in Americans' foreign policy a decade and a half after 9/11. And later on the show, how did the trauma of 9/11 reshape our lives and culture? Good morning. I am Yael Avi, and thank you for joining us. Today is 9/11, and we dedicate our broadcast to the memory of the lives lost and changed by what can be deemed the worst terror attack in modern history. Now, 13 years after the September 11 attacks, U.S. President Barack Obama faces another terror group front and addressed the American nation with a speech in which he outlined the agenda against the latest threat to the world, the Islamic State. In a speech out of Washington just hours ago, the president promised to degrade and ultimately destroy the terrorist group ISIS with words reminiscent of the ones we heard against al-Qaeda, which perpetrated the 9/11 attacks. Now, to hear more about it, we are joined in studio by research fellow at the INSS and lecturer at Tel Aviv University, Dr. Benedetta Berti. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And by former Israeli consul to New York, Alon Pinkas. Alon, good morning to you as well. Of course, before we start with all of this, let's take a look at what President Barack Obama said just a few hours ago in the highly anticipated speech out of Washington, D.C., outlining his agenda for and against ISIS.
Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy. First, we will conduct a systematic campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists. Working with the Iraqi government, we will expand our efforts beyond protecting our own people and humanitarian missions so that we're hitting ISIL targets as Iraqi forces go on offense. Moreover, I've made it clear that we will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are. That means I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL in Syria as well as Iraq. This is a core principle of my presidency. If you threaten America, you will find no safe haven.
Former Israeli consul to New York, Alon Pinkas, I would like to start with you and actually refer you to another American president a few years ago talking about Iraq, speaking about Iraq and the threat it poses, be it Iraq or al-Qaeda. Let's hear what President Bush had to say about a decade ago.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Let's start by asking this. Major operations in Iraq have clearly not ended.
No, they have not.
Okay, and we are facing another operation. I think, I'm not even counting, I think it's the third one. And today, 9/11, 2014, I'd like to start with you and ask you, is this never ending? Is the United States, is President Obama making the same mistake that the former President Bush made?
Well, time will tell if it's a mistake, but there is a major difference between the two. President Bush, Bush 43, made a connection between Iraq and 9/11, a connection that never existed, was never supported by intelligence, was in fact a result of manipulated intelligence. Obama, and he said it in his speech last night, Obama has stated clearly that the core, one of the core issues of his presidency is the war on terrorism. And his record on the war on terrorism is almost impeccable. If you look at what he's done in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan.
Afghanistan is impeccable.
It's impeccable in the war against terrorism.
Okay.
Now, as opposed, the comparison between the two is that Bush invaded two countries. First, Afghanistan in 2001, late 2001, and then in early 2003, he invaded Iraq. Obama, and time will tell if I'm right here, Obama is stating clearly that he intends to refrain from boot operation, from ground operation, and he said we will conduct a sustained air campaign, but the Iraqi military, whatever is left of that, but that's a different issue, the Iraqi military will conduct the actual ground operation against ISIL. If I were Obama, and I'm not going to judge the contents of the speech, it's just a framework, I would not use the terms destroy ISIL, because ISIL can be militarily downgraded, degraded, pulverized, call it what you want. The idea that underlines ISIL cannot be destroyed by F-15s or F-14s.
Dr. Bernadette Porter of the INSS, let's hit on the same issue right now, okay? Because, I will agree that, the invasion into Iraq in 2003 was most likely one of the most colossal mistakes made in Middle Eastern history. There I've said it. But if we're looking at Obama's speech last night, outlining another plan of, again, degrading, use whichever terminology you want to say, isn't there this big danger that when you go into the Middle East to try and degrade or change a certain, and prevent a foe, you then create another foe. You create more animosities. And can that even be done by the United States from the air, as outlined by President Obama yesterday?
Right. I think these are two separate and very valid issues. Let's start with tackle the you do something, you create another enemy. Well, that's something that, for example, has been said in the past years about the drone campaign, which has been quite effective, targeting and downgrading Al-Qaeda and its affiliates in the regions in terms of leadership, but it has, of course, created a lot of resentment on the ground. And that's an ongoing discussion. Will we get to the same problem here? Well, that is a valid criticism, but I don't think it should be at this point a reason not to do anything. Some of the critics has been, whatever you do in the Middle East ends up worse. Whatever you do in the Middle East, you end up in a quagmire, and then you're left with no action. And quite frankly, if we look at what the no action in Syria has done in the past 3 years, well, there you have it. There you have the rise of ISIS, then becoming the Islamic State, and now we are in a situation in which not taking action is just simply not an option. So I would be very wary towards looking at the potential dangers as a reason why never to do anything. At the same time, doing whatever, as President Obama said over and over, it's also not an answer. And here we find ourselves, I think, with a little bit of a pickle, because I understand the president does not want to have boots on the ground, does not to be dragged into yet another Middle Eastern war. There is no support from the American people for any boots on the ground. So that's something that he has to work with. At the same time, airstrikes alone, without a credible offensive operation against ISIS on the ground, both in Iraq and in Syria, it's probably not going to do the job. And that's where we find ourselves with a problem, because the Iraqi army is not really up to the job.
Is there an Iraqi army? Yes.
Exactly. And then we get to Syria. In Syria, he has been much more elusive here on what is going to happen in Syria. And the rise of the Islamic State started in Syria. It was the rise in Syria that galvanized Baghdadi and went then into Syria. There was, I'm not going to get into the whole internal politics, but from Jabhat al-Nusra, we have ISIS, and it started there. And there, the jihadists, between mostly ISIS, control about 30% of the country. So there has to be a strategy for Syria too.
No, definitely. And I'd like to take your point about the strategy that the American President Obama spoke about just a few hours ago in that address to the nation regarding American forces. Let's hear what he promised the American people there.
We'll increase our support to forces fighting these terrorists on the ground. In June, I deployed several hundred American service members to Iraq to assess how we can best support Iraqi security forces. Now that those teams have completed their work and Iraq has formed a government, we will send an additional 475 service members to Iraq. As I've said before, these American forces will not have a combat mission. We will not get dragged into another ground war in Iraq. But they are needed to support Iraqi and Kurdish forces with training, intelligence, and equipment. We'll increase our support.
Alon Pinkas, former Israeli consul in New York, when President Obama outlined such a plan, okay, and you were mentioning Yemen before, that's, first of all, he's talking about a sustained air attack, 3 years. He's actually leaving a legacy for the next president in many ways, which is also slightly problematic. But can it even be done in the Middle East? And, when we look at the forces that he's trying to support on the ground, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, I'm assuming, but there's also talk of Iranian fighters actually helping out in that battle. So that's basically what he's speaking about. Isn't that creating more, actually picking sides in the region?
He has no choice. you can't pick sides. The dynamics, the uncertainties, the variables are plenty and numerous and almost endless. And the changes right now are so rapid that you have two choices. You either act and there are consequences, or you stay home and there are consequences. I relate to what Bernadette said before. The fact that it's murky and unclear doesn't mean that you can conclude or deduce from that you can stay home. You cannot stay home.
You cannot stay home, but can you do it just from the air?
Well, no, you cannot do it just from the air. You cannot do it just from the air. But this is his choice of strategy at this point. He has several dilemmas. How to show that he's engaged without being dragged into another quagmire in the Middle East, number one. Number two, how do you cooperate with Syria without cooperating with Syria? How do you explain to yourself when you shave every morning that you're actually working with Assad but not attacking Assad?
Not only that, I would like to remind you that you and I sat here exactly a year ago on a broadcast regarding 9/11 on the eve of 9/11 2013.
Right.
President Obama gave a speech outlining his plan of attack against Syria, against Assad,
Yes.
after the attack.
And I think that's next. Not necessarily a military attack. I don't, look, the Syrian foreign minister came out with this ridiculous statement that they will not allow U.S. air activity without coordinating it with the Syrian Air Force. I don't think anyone in Washington is taking this seriously, nor should they. First of all, ISIL is concentrated in the northernmost part of Syria, close to the Iraqi border, which means that the extent of aerial control that the Syrians have is limited in the best case, number one. Number two, I don't think the Syrians, the Assad regime will risk confronting American jets in the air because they will be shot down. And so I don't see, look, we've had this discussion, like you said. It's not aesthetic to say, and it's not moral to pronounce. However, the U.S., Russia, Israel have a vested interest in Assad staying in power. Yes, Assad staying in power.
No, I agree with you, but that said, you know, when a year ago, there's a red line drawn, and actually, Dr. Purdy, I'd like to bring you into this. A year ago, President Obama draws a red line in the sand against President Assad, and clearly right now the world understands he had to say that, you know, he's not supporting Assad right now, but he needs him. He needs him.
I'm not sure. Let me try to bring out the counterpoint to that,
okay.
the counter argument. Well, first of all, this goes 100% within the parameters of what Assad's propaganda has been saying from day one. So this is definitely serving the regime. The regime from day one, when you had a peaceful, political, non-sectarian revolution,
Islamic State, ISIS,
March 2011, went on TV and started saying, they're all terrorists. You stick with me and I will protect my people against this terrorist. So this is sort of part of his campaign. Now, how has it unfolded 3 years later? He has unfolded 3 years later that the more the civil war has prolonged and become protracted and bloody, the more this has become sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. How is that the case? The case is that what used to be once the main rebel group fighting the Assad regime, which was the Free Syrian Army with its national coalition operating from abroad, has become one of the, I wouldn't say weakest party, but much weakened, because it's been one of the only groups not receiving training, not receiving assistance, not receiving money. So the money started flowing into Syria, mostly from the Gulf, and started helping the more radical groups, the Salafist groups, and it started to create that dynamic in which we found ourselves today, in which those factions we can actually work with have become the weakened one. And if you want to look at what's happening right now in Aleppo, then you have the Free Syrian Army fighting the Assad regime south and ISIS in the north. So they're actually waging two wars that are both something that the West should support, and that's something Obama has alluded to. He also said that he wants Congress to support any plan to train and equip the Syrian opposition. Fine, but there is someone on the ground who is fighting Assad, there is someone on the ground who is fighting ISIS. What they don't have is the means to do it effectively, and the international community should support them, as opposed to support Assad, who is the reason in the first place why we find ourselves in this situation. And that's something that's often forgotten. The Assad regime did not target the jihadist groups for the first 2 years of the revolution. It did not target them because he wanted specifically to show to the Syrian population that it was a choice between him and them, but it's a false choice.
It's a false choice, but it is, it's what the people of Syria are reading. That said, I tend to agree, I think, Alon Pinkas, I think you are right. I think that Israel, the United States, and Russia understand that right now Assad is not movable, that they need him in place right now. Isn't that the case? But what does that spell to the people of the Middle East? I'm talking about the Muslims of the Middle East, when a year ago there's a red line drawn in the sand, and we were standing like 2 seconds before an attack against Syria, and just a year later, he's sort of, he's backtracking, he's blaming Assad, he's not going to support him, but it's clear he's staying in place.
Okay. Obama's decision not to attack Syria, in hindsight, was the right decision. As a result of that decision, or concurrent with that decision, was a UN Security Council resolution to disarm Syria's chemical stockpiles. And that is a success. It's not a perfect solution, but that is a relative
But Assad
success.
is still in place.
Because no one wants him out. Because no one really wants him out. Now, Obama can look back at his critics and detractors from the last 2 years or year and a half and say, you wanted me to support the rebels? Look who the rebels are. And don't tell me that they were moderate to begin with and then they kind of mutated into ISIL. This is who they were. They were not Jeffersonian Democrats to begin with, who became Daesh or ISIL, who cut off people's
ISIL,
heads.
Islamic State. We're now at the Islamic State. That's what they're called now, right? Formerly known as ISIL. Yeah.
Well, it was Daesh, it was ISIS, it was ISIL. Now it's IS. It's got all these different names. I think that, again, if he could change the wording of his statement at the time when he drew a red line relating to the use of chemical weapons, I'm sure that President Obama would have changed the wording of his statement. What about the message to the peoples of the Middle East? There are two messages here. One is, if you look at the coalition that is being formed these days, there are two coalitions here.
Right.
There is a symbolic political coalition that was announced at the end of the NATO summit in Newport, Wales. But that's just to show that this is a priority and that this is something being taken seriously. No one expects Polish commando forces to operate in northern Iraq, although Poland pledged its support.
Right. Well, thank God for that.
The second coalition is the coalition that has been formed in the last roughly 48 hours. That includes Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Jordan, and Turkey. The common denominator is that they are all Sunni. This is, well, you asked about the message to the people of the Middle East.
Yeah.
Not all Sunnis are ISIL.
No, clearly.
And there are many Sunnis who are willing to fight ISIL. And the United States of America, I am not standing and fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Shiite Iranians. I am putting many eggs in several baskets.
Not fight shoulder to shoulder, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Berti, aren't the air attacks of the United States actually supporting also Iranian fighters on the ground in Iraq?
Well, you can put it that way, but this happens to be one issue where there are different parties that are very sharp disagreements on other scenarios. For example, the Saudis and the Iranians, which have completely different preferences for Syria. But when it comes to tackling ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq, then there is a temporary convergence of interest. So the American airstrikes are serving American interests, and at this particular time, there's something that the Iranians also favor. But
they're also, they're helping Iranian fighters on the ground in Iraq.
Let's not forget that
in addition to Peshmerga Kurdish fighters.
Sure. If you want to phrase it that way, just think of what the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003 did to Iran. I mean, it removed one of Iran's main enemies in the Middle East. It wasn't done for Iranians, but of course, it also resulted in a temporary improvement of the balance of power in the Middle East for Iranians. I mean, everything you do as a reaction, and some of the reactions may benefit some of your political, I don't want to say foes, but the countries in the region that are not necessarily your allies. So this is one of those cases where there is a short-term convergence of interest between parties that actually have very different visions for what they want for the Middle East. And the case of the Saudis and the Iranians being happy about ISIS being degraded in Iraq is a good case, because at the same time they still have completely mutually opposite interests in Syria. So this is a short-term, I think, momentum of consensus that is being created around ISIS just because of the sheer extremism of the group and their methods and their plan. Their vision for al-Sham includes Iraq, includes Syria, includes Lebanon, and we can talk about what they've been doing in Lebanon in the past months, and it also includes Jordan and Israel ultimately. So it threatens a number of key players.
No, it's the chessboard it is, but if we're looking at the coalition, and I'm glad that Alon Pincus mentioned it, let's first, let's break it down, but first hear what President Obama had to say about the forming coalition that is supposed to support the American campaign against the Islamic State.
But this is not our fight alone. American power can make a decisive difference, but we cannot do for Iraqis what they must do for themselves. Nor can we take the place of Arab partners in securing their region. And that's why I've insisted that additional U.S. action depended upon Iraqis forming an inclusive government, which they have now done in recent days. So tonight, with a new Iraqi government in place and following consultations with allies abroad and Congress at home, I can announce that America will lead a broad coalition to roll back this terrorist threat.
Mr. Pincus, this broad coalition that Dr. Bird just mentioned, that there's a convergence of agreement between, which I'm sorry, I'd like to believe that will happen, but it's hard after, being a product of the Middle East, a convergence of, ideas between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and, that this is...
She's right. It's an ad hoc convergence of interest. It may disappear in 6 months, but right now it exists.
6 months. This sounds like the coalition of the unwilling rather than the...
So nonetheless, it's a coalition.
Okay, and what can they do? But at the end of the day, because this is the battle, it's Shiite versus Sunni in the Middle East.
It's more complicated than that.
Okay, to simplify it for our audience, at the end of this coalition, isn't every side going to expect something in return that actually goes completely against the other members of the coalition?
Yes, absolutely.
Isn't that the problem?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Look, let's not forget, let's not lose the ball here. Keep your eyes on the ball. The threat to Saudi Arabia, to the Gulf, to Israel is still Iran. It remains Iran. The fact that we have this televised social media phenomenon called Daesh, ISIL, ISIS, for good reasons and justifications, makes it the #1 priority. But in the long run, Iran remains a threat. Now, what President Obama was doing, he was catering to American public opinion that is basically essentially saying, the hell with the Middle East. Why can't they ever solve their own problems? Why have we, America, become the 911, apropos
9/11, yes,
of the world community? Why every time there's an issue, they pick up the phone and call us? What does Obama expect from from his allies? I don't know, because we like to talk about the Saudi-Iranian difference.
A difference is putting it very mildly.
There are major differences between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And Turkey is a NATO member. Well, forget Erdogan, the personality issue here. But Turkey is a major contributing member of NATO. And Turkey has different interests in Syria and no problems with Iran right now. Again, these are shifting sands here in the Middle East. Yes, these coalitions are going to change, but right now there is a threat to the stability of the world order, of the regional order, and that threat is posed clearly by ISIL.
There seems to be an agreement to that, but Dr. Birdie, I'd like to ask you, because we are marking 9/11 today. This is 13 years to these horrific attacks, and at the end of those attacks, it feels like the United States missed an opportunity to ask a question of, actually try and answer of why do they hate us so much, and take a deep look at American foreign policy leading up to those horrific attacks. I'm not pointing any fingers, but I was there, you were there. It wasn't PC to ask that question, and there were American troops and involvement on the ground in the Middle East, which created many animosities, as we discussed at the beginning of this interview. Again, isn't this doing the same over and over again? Has the United States, 13 years on, do you believe, learned something from, what happened 13 years ago?
I think it has. Firstly, And I mean, we keep going back to that point, but I think it's important. Obama has no intention of sending a substantial military presence in the back.
Which he says right now. I mean, that's what he says.
I believe that that's also what he wants, and if anything, wants to kick the ball down to the next president on this and keep on with the airstrikes as long as he can. I think the United States has learned a lot about the challenges, not just of fighting irregular warfare in areas it's not familiar with, but also most significantly the challenges of post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction, which is something that has been, I would say, failure. I think failure is a harsh word, but perhaps we can use it both in the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan. But at the same time, if you look at cases in which the international community did help up to the mission accomplished and then left and did not take part in the post-conflict stabilization, and I'm thinking Libya, of course, the situation there is not much better in terms of stability and having the country on the road to democratization, which leads to the very basic points that these affairs this is very complex and long-term business. And I think the United States has learned that, and I don't see the United States eagerly wanting to go back into Iraq to fix its very, very broken political system. And this is perhaps the main reason why we don't have a much more decisive action in Syria.
It's as you said, it's a fairly vague. With the time that we have left, Mr. Pincus, you said, I mean, as you know, he's trying to do this from the air, as he said yesterday, and as you are, as the point that you pushed on, but he can't do this for 3 years. The United States can't do this.
Surely can. Why not?
Just from the air, without getting down on the ground.
Absolutely. He has no vested interest in sending the 82nd Airborne Division into northern Iraq. On the one hand. On the other hand, he can't go back and blame George Bush 10 years,
that's
8 years.
Yeah, that's
why did you dismantle the Iraqi army? You made a mistake. Okay, it's a sine qua non. We know it was a mistake. This is who he is. Don't forget that the U.S. is on the verge of energy independence. The U.S. is fed up with Arab politics and Arab alliances.
Embracing isolationism.
There is not isolation. Just moving or shifting its focus to different areas. The U.S. is looking at the Middle East. It sees three major powers: Turkey, Iran, and Israel. None of which is Arab. You just look at what's going on in Syria and Iraq right now, and you understand the frustration of the American public, which is being terrified by the images of ISIL, but not willing to commit
to anything.
The long-term, for good reasons,
forever.
By the way.
And sadly, that's all the time we have. Thank you both for joining me. When we get back, an exclusive interview with Time Magazine's political columnist and author of the novel Primary Colors and Politics Lost, Mr. Joe Klein, as we mark 13 years to 9/11. Stay with us. First, the news. And thank you for staying with us. I-24 News Morning Edition. And today we mark 13 years to 9/11 and dedicate our broadcast to the lives lost and changed by the horrific attacks of that day. Now, the 9/11 attacks were a series of 4 coordinated terrorist attacks launched by Al-Qaeda in the United States. The attacks killed almost 3,000 people. They caused at least $10 billion in property and infrastructure damage. But above all, they changed the world forever and still do. Now, let's take a look at a report that takes us through the last decade and a half since that fateful day.
The 21st century, as we know it, began here on September 11, 2001. The hijacked planes which crashed the World Trade Center in New York caused the horrifying death of nearly 3,000 people. The combined attack on the Pentagon, alongside the dramatic collapse of the buildings, which epitomized U.S. global domination, was too much to bear on live television. U.S. President George W. Bush sent that day a clear message which set the stage for the war on terror.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Soon, Osama bin Laden, the founder of Al-Qaeda, which executed the attacks, was targeted.
There's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, "Wanted, dead or alive."
Operation Enduring Freedom was in full effect less than a month after the 9/11 attacks. Its objective was to eliminate al-Qaeda activity in Afghanistan and later led to overthrowing the Taliban's extremist rule. More than 2,000 U.S. soldiers were killed during the fighting in Afghanistan, as well as 10,000 militants. The war on terror was then ready to expand. In 2003, Iraq was next, as more than 100,000 U.S. troops invaded the country following a stated mission which called to disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction and free the Iraqi people. In April 2003, the Firdos Square statue of Saddam Hussein was toppled, marking the end of his regime. A month later, President Bush landed on aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln to deliver his mission accomplished speech.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. The war on terror is not over, yet it is not endless.
Later that year, U.S. Army forces captured Saddam Hussein in his hideout. Hussein was then put on trial and finally executed in 2008. As the war on terror continued, international criticism of U.S. and its allied nations' actions grew louder. President Bush was even publicly humiliated in 2008 when an Iraqi journalist threw his shoes at him as a final send-off. It was President Obama who orchestrated the operation, which everyone was waiting for. On May 2, 2011, Obama gave this address.
The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda. The American people did not choose this fight. It came to our shores and started with the senseless slaughter of our citizens.
Victory celebrations were cut short as new threats have now emerged. The brutal acts by the Islamic State and Boko Haram organizations do suggest that the war on terror is no longer a military campaign, but an ongoing fight for survival.
Earlier, we spoke to the political columnist for Time magazine, author of the novel Primary Colors, Mr. Joe Klein, about how America's foreign policy has changed after 9/11. Let's take a look. He is possibly one of the most seasoned political writers in the United States, author of 6 books, amongst them Primary Colors and recently Politics Lost. He's covered every presidential campaign of recent decades and, of course, witnessed 9/11 firsthand in New York City 13 years ago. He's Time magazine columnist Joe Klein, whom we are very honored to speak with today. Joe, thank you for joining us. Firstly,
it's great to be with you.
Amen. Now, firstly, 9/11, 2001, Americans and very much so New Yorkers changed forever. What do you think happened to them internally that day?
Well, I can tell you what happened to me internally that day and externally. I live in a small town just north of New York City, and 9 of my neighbors didn't come home that day. And all of a sudden, when I look at it in retrospect, we had to start living like Israelis. All of a sudden, we had to become citizens again. I mean, Americans have always felt very protected by our 2 big oceans. And after 9/11, especially in New York, we weren't protected anymore. And I remember that the forces of social capital in town, which is kind of a euphemism for the women, immediately got together and put together menu schedules for the 9 affected widows and their families, so that the widows wouldn't have to cook for another month or so. And then we heard that they needed shovels and gloves down at Ground Zero, and everybody went out to the local Home Depot and the other hardware stores and bought them out and brought all the shovels and gloves to the local fire station. But we were very conscious in that moment of who we were and why we were being attacked and how we had to respond. And for Americans in general, and I think for New Yorkers in particular, it meant that we had to become citizens again, active citizens.
No, very much so. And I was there as well. I remember that sense of community, which was, for New York City, remarkable as everything is for that city. You said something very interesting that, everybody knew how they were attacked. It's the why, I think, that was missing. And that's where I want to lead to, at the time in 2001, immediately after the attack, it seemed like it was not PC to examine America's foreign policy leading up to, to 9/11. But critics would say that it was exactly the period missed of looking into U.S. foreign policy in the years leading up to 9/11-2001. U.S. troops were on the ground in the Middle East creating animosities. Do you think that was the case? Because it seemed like nobody at the time was asking, why do they hate us so much, or answering that question?
Well, I think we were asking it, but perhaps not answering it.
Right.
And, the irony is that things have gotten so much worse since then because of our, insensitive response since. I mean, my feeling at the time, and I went up to West Point to talk to counterinsurgency and special forces experts.
Right.
My feeling was that this was going to be a special forces war. And the way we started out in Afghanistan was the right way to do it. But then we lost sight of who the real enemy was by taking the war to Iraq and veering off of Al-Qaeda. Now we're at a moment where we're going to go back in, and not in the same way we went into Iraq the first time, but in a way that I think is more proportionate and reasonable. But the thing that every American should have learned by now, and I'm not sure that we have, is that the era of neo-colonialist interventions in the Middle East is over.
I mean, have they learned it? That's the thing that I'm wondering. This time last year, you actually wrote, and I'm quoting, on the eve of the 12th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Barack Obama made the strongest possible case for the use of force against Bashar Assad's Syrian regime. And I'm quoting your article this time and last year. Obviously, Barack Obama giving a speech, same time, 13 years after 9/11, detailing his campaign for another campaign attack against another big foe in the Middle East. Has the American administration really learned its lesson? I mean, if you just said that it's going to be more calculated, this new campaign, but it always sparks another foe. So what has really changed?
Well, this is the same old foe. I mean, this is the foe who we're going to have to be contesting probably for the rest of the century. It's very different from trying to insert ourselves and pick sides in a Syrian civil war. I thought the president's behavior a year ago was kind of embarrassing, setting up red lines and then, lifting his red lines. In this case, I think he has learned his lesson, and I think that we're going in with a coalition, and we're going in with, some new partners. We're going to have to be very careful about how this goes forward. But I think our relationship with Assad has turned 180 degrees since last year, and I think that, as we've seen recently and early, our relationship with Iran may be undergoing a change as well. And so
something that I have to say, people that hearing it where I'm sitting at are not going to like it. Yeah.
Well, I know it's going to be of great concern in Israel, but in some ways it's back to where things used to be, where Israel and Iran before the revolution were allies.
Definitely.
And the United States. But I think that what we have here is a common enemy, which is Al-Qaeda-style Salafist terrorism, and the more nations and groups that can join together in that fight, I think the more acceptable the United States presence is going to be.
One can only hope. And finally, last questions. Americans, we started with this, but Americans, the people, their frame of mind, 13 years on, you're there. How would you describe it?
Well, I think that it's
been many wars
for a very long time.
Yeah.
For a very long time, people had kind of forgotten about the threat. And over the last few months, especially with the beheadings of the American journalists and the terrible humanitarian situations in northern Iraq, I think that Americans now, and according to the latest polls, it's very apparent that Americans are ready to contest this very real threat to us and to all of Europe and all of civilization.
Right. Mr. Joe Klein, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Now, we are very glad to be joined in studio by Yaki Dayan, former Israeli consul in Los Angeles. I'm glad you're here. You heard the speech, Obama's speech yesterday. As we said, we're marking 9/11. You were there in the United States in 2001. But before we touch on that, what was reminiscent to you about Obama's speech? We had this little chat as our pieces were running. That he sounded a bit like another American president?
Good morning, Yael. Yes, you could have closed your eyes and think that George W. Bush is actually carrying this speech. And Obama, 6 years later, after promising the American people that I'm going to pull out from Iraq,
Which he did,
yet declaring of another war in Iraq and wider than that in Syria as well. And 13 years after, and we are exactly 13 years after the United States spent trillions of dollars and thousands of soldiers, the life of thousands of soldiers, right. And they are back to the same point of this war against Islamic fundamentalism, war against terrorism. I'm sure that Obama, if he could have chose, he wouldn't have stood there and carried this speech because he doesn't believe that this is what the Americans should do. But the Middle East is and especially Islamic terrorism is the Ebola, and he understands now that this is not some kind of a local virus that he can ignore. He understands that this is an Ebola that eventually is bound to knock on the doors of the United States as on the doors of Europe and other allies of the United States.
Which is the biggest fear, but as you said, 13 years on, and I keep asking this question to the people who have honored us in the studio or spoken to us today, do you think that the American administration, this one, its foreign policy, has learned its lesson, and what are they doing? As we said, I'll keep harping on it, last year, another speech by Obama drawing a red line in the sand. This year, talking about a campaign from the air. But what can be done against this so-called big foe, the Ebola?
If we speak about the foreign policy of Obama, I think it's the perception definitely in the Middle East is of weakness, of really strong weakness of the Obama administration, an administration that started their strategy regarding the Middle East, that let's pull out from the wars in the Middle East, let's hug the Muslim and the Muslim community. Then it evolved to leading from behind, as happened in Libya. Then it evolved to let's not do stupid stuff, as Obama said. And now he's standing there and declaring some kind of a war, which, it's in a way, it's a disproportionate war against an army of small terrorists, 15,000 terrorists.
20,000.
Exactly, on trucks. And then he's forming some kind of an international global coalition. And what frightens me is that in this global coalition that he's creating is he's standing there with Saudi Arabia, that 13 years after the country that actually supported the terrorists in 9/11.
That spawned bin Laden,
exactly. Iran now is becoming a potential ally, and let's not forget that Iran is still thriving to have their nuclear capabilities. And I hope that eventually in this global coalition against this very pinpointed terrorist organization, we will not pay a heavier price. So what I can say about the American policy is that it's an ongoing bad policy of the United States, and I'm not only crediting this president for that, I'm crediting the former president for that, but we have two consecutive presidents, Bush and Obama, that is leaving a very I would say negative legacy in the region, a legacy of weakness to the United States. And eventually this weakness is projecting on Israel as well, because Israel is considered as the strongest ally that the United States has in the region. And unfortunately, also this policy, and this is going to be, by the way, this is going to be the legacy of this president to the next president.
To the next president, leaving him with that campaign. Yaki Dayan, we could continue forever. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's hear some more of the morning headlines now. Thank you for staying with us. I-24 News Morning Edition, where we mark today, 9/11/2014, 13 years to the fateful attacks on the United States that, the biggest terrorist attacks in in mankind history that changed the world forever. Earlier, we had an opportunity to speak with Israeli consul in New York nowadays, Ido Aharoni, about how Americans are faring today, 13 years after the fact. And we are joined from New York right now by Consul General of Israel in New York City, Mr. Ido Aharoni. Mr. Aharoni, thank you for joining us this morning. First of all, good morning to you. Quick question to you to start off, as we were wondering, how is 9/11 today, and 13 years on, being marked in the United States and New York City in particular?
9/11 is always going to be a very special and important and meaningful and a deep day, a day of commemoration, a day of reflection, a day of remembrance for all the American people, but particularly here in New York, the city that was hit hard on that fateful day. I was here on that day, and I remember it very vividly. It changed New York in many ways, I think, but one of the more visible and evident ways is the fact that New Yorkers today are more united than ever post 9/11. You could see it the year after 9/11. We had here the blackout.
Right.
When we lost electricity. I was here also during the blackout in the summer of 2002. The level of camaraderie, everybody was talking about it, the solidarity, the friendship, displays of mutual help and mutual aid. It was clearly related to 9/11.
No, very much so. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the blackout, because I was there as well, and I remember it was amazing that people were not looting stores, actually giving out food. Clearly a result of having to be unified. But as you mentioned, we also spoke to Joe Klein today of Time magazine, and he said that, Americans have changed. And if you were there in, 13 years ago, other than the unification, do you think that, have you noticed more of a sense of more nationalism in the country? Their politics changing in accordance?
Well, not so much partisan politics, but I think the understanding of what's happening around us, especially looking at the Middle East differently, understanding that what's at stake here is not just, when it comes to Israel at least, not just a conflict about land, but rather a clash between values, a clash between concepts. One friend put it beautifully. He said, "This is not about land, it's about freedom." And I think that 9/11 has a lot to do with this emerging realization on the part of the entire American people, especially American intellectuals. You see it mostly in the academic world, realizing that what really is happening is a clash between two value systems. Samuel Huntington put it, a clash between two civilizations. One that is all about the advancement of knowledge and basic liberties and freedoms, and that is all about nurturing life and the celebration of life, and one culture, one civilization that wants to take us all back to the Dark Ages, that is opposing putting the value of learning and advancement of knowledge in the center of life and the center of society.
Definitely. And finally, do you think that because of that trauma experienced 13 years ago, Americans actually can stand behind, continue to stand behind Israel, the understanding of the threat of terror?
Well, I think that every public opinion survey, every study that was conducted on this issue shows that Americans stand by Israel and stood by Israel for reasons that have a lot to do with their morals, with their values. Realizing that Israel is, so to speak, an outpost of American values in the Middle East. It's not so much about what we do as about what we stand for. And the fact that we stand for the same values and we cherish the same values, I think that's the key factor to understanding the position, the positive position of the American people and the American political system when it comes to Israel.
To Israel, definitely. Israeli Consul Ido Aharoni in New York, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Now, 13 years after the 9/11 attacks, we can see that they reshaped many facets of life in America. The attacks and their coverage in the media raised profound questions about how the attacks shook people's notion of the role of professional journalists in reporting on trauma. The American lexicon was one of the things that changed drastically in the months and years after the attack. Among words and phrases that entered everyday language were Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Ground Zero, radicalism, extremism, anthrax, and the axis of evil. Their usage dramatically increased and soon became part of Americans' everyday life. How did all these changes reflect into our culture, Western culture, and possibly also the freedom of the press is a question I'd like to ask my guest today in the studio, Uri Misgav, Israeli journalist, columnist, blogger for Haaretz, and of course I'm also with Tony Grant. Before we discuss the press, I'd like to mention that all three of us were actually in New York on that fateful day. Where were you?
I actually was there. I was woken up by the first crash and immediately ran to see what's happening because I was a working journalist.
You were a journalist. Yeah.
And I didn't know, of course, what am I going
What are we going into?
Yeah. No one thought that the buildings will collapse, but they collapsed exactly when I went out of the subway.
And Tony, I think you mentioned to me once.
I was there. Actually, I was a freelance journalist, so when I heard the first crash, but I actually didn't know what it was, and freelance, went back to bed. But I was 18 blocks away, and a friend called and said, "Have you turned on the news?" I said, "I have no TV." He said, "Well, step out." Freelance, low budget. He said, "Step outside." So I hung up and I walked outside, and of course, by the time I was out there, one of the towers, the South Tower, gone. And so it was, it was about, I don't know, a quarter of a mile away. And so just that was the first sort of image that I had there was the startling absence of something that you're just so used to seeing. And then, of course, I couldn't get back into my apartment because of all the emergency vehicles. Right. That was so, and then it was craziness. But yeah, the visual punch is something that sticks with you.
When you were there, and I remember coming out, I was in a control room. I was actually working for an American network, and watching those towers come down, you knew the world had, in that instant, changed forever. And I want to look at, because I remember after 9/11, the months following up to, I was a working journalist, and I was sent to D.C. And there was one, there were press conference daily. Ari Fleischer was sitting there speaking. He was the spokesman of the White House. One journalist stood up and asked him, Mr. Fleischer, do you think that American foreign policy had anything to do with the, what happened on, on American soil? And he said to her, I cannot believe you have the guts to ask me such an unpatriotic question. Exactly. And all of us shut up. Nobody actually raised a hand and said, what is a patriotic question? We have to ask questions. What do you think, what was the trend that followed in America after those attacks?
I remember being a foreign journalist in the States. I remember myself pretty amazed by the quickness that things have changed. And you said language has changed. Patriotism was the first reaction. Suddenly you saw the American flag on every corner of a screen.
And rightfully so in many ways. I mean,
yes, no, I didn't have complaints about, but it was interesting. The next thing was a sport event. Football games, everything was, with a gesture to the soldiers, to the army, to the armed forces,
to the country,
to the flag. That was the first reaction. Then came the nationalism, and I'm sorry to say that, but for many press people and newspapers and channels, they took upon themselves limitations that no one even asked them to take. It was self-restriction. That question that you mentioned. Hardly, I never heard those questions anymore. Criticism was anti-patriotism.
Was anti-patriotic, and there were critics that would argue that that was exactly the time to actually raise questions that look at American foreign policy in other countries, and and when you look at the last 13 years of American media, would you say that it maintained? I'm talking about mainstream media. Has it maintained that type of operating? Of modus operandi, so to speak?
For me, the turning point was the Iraq invasion, because Afghanistan was still a counter-reaction to 9/11. When the Iraq invasion took place, and there were not enough questions. What does it have to do with it? Where are we going here? And so we were left with the New York Times.
That's not even not enough. There were almost none.
Yeah.
Even the New York Times was kind of shying away.
Yes, things have started to change a little bit or go back to normal place in the first days of the Obama regime, because at least you had Democrat and Republicans again. You had balance of power. But then I think the most interesting reaction for me as a journalist was the WikiLeaks. And then Edward Snowden, because those were, for me, those were like internal reactions of people that took upon themselves to
privately to explore, to investigate, to look at, and we're talking specifically about Iraq, which was, as we said, a result of 9/11, falsely sold. We can say it nowadays, to the American public as something that was connected to 9/11. Yeah.
And Tony knows much more about that than me, but I want to name one program that did the change. I can't imagine the Jon Stewart show being broadcast in the years after 9/11. It's quite a bold show. I think it would be considered unpatriotic and very critical in those days. And maybe there
were things he most likely not have said, which he does now, which as time passes.
True. With passage of time, it has become easier.
But Tony, I want to lead to you because you have, how is 9/11 covered in the press 13 years after the fact?
Well, I would say in terms of this anniversary, the events, the commemorations, it's very kind of a matter of fact, straightforward kind of reporting. Sure. Sort of. Actually, there's two things in the New York papers. For example, the New York Daily News has the story that for New Yorkers, September 11th is remembered more than once a year, and how the tragedy actually has become a part of the DNA of New York. And interesting. This is a New York paper, and I'm looking at this as someone who was a New Yorker, as an American, and it's true. It is part of the DNA of New York, also of America, but I always found there was a disconnect between people who are actually there on the ground, like us, and people in, say, Wyoming, watching everything on TV, because we had, we could smell the metal in the air, the smoke.
For weeks,
I mean,
you
awful
could smell,
things.
exactly. You could smell
for weeks. It was impacting our lives very, very directly, and what bothered me, and it's come out in the press too, some of the stories, is that you had this sort of aggressiveness sort of seep into, I think, into American culture. I remember when I flew finally out, when airports were open, and I went back to California, and in the old days before the TSA, you could park your car like on the curb, and so I did that, waiting for someone at the airport, and some security person yelled at me, like very aggressive, get your car out of the loading zone. Haven't you heard about 9/11? And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I have no idea. I don't have a clue. It's this sort of aggressive stance, which I think led to so many things. The
Joe Klein
earlier
said that 9/11 turned New Yorkers into Israelis.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
When you say,
as Israelis, we knew it wasn't strange for us to see security people checking bags, or to take your shoes off in
for
airports.
Us, though, it was
for Americans,
for
it was like freedom lost.
Freedom lost.
In many
tainted.
And what else in terms of press today?
Again, we have this talking about bigger issues. The New Yorker had a story about. This is a very political kind of thing, actually. But again, it's the other side of coverage. It's the sort of the enduring mysteries / conspiracy theories about certain aspects. But when the New Yorker talks about it, you've got to pay attention. The 9/11.
I do. Yes.
You see a picture in the New Yorker of former Saudi ambassador Prince Bandar bin Sultan with Bush. In 2002 at the Crawford Ranch. They're very buddy-buddy. And the story is about the 28 pages that were redacted, missing from the 9/11 Commission report. Why? Because it talks about Saudi implication in the attacks on some level, a substantive level, but what level? Only some congressmen know. And there's this drive to release it to the public. What did Bush know? What did the government know and not know? Huge issues which just don't go away because no one ever actually. Where were the aggressive journalists demanding to see the papers?
Almost a segment of that was in Fahrenheit 9/11 of Michael Moore.
But
again, how many people saw
that? I knew that, and I'm so glad you brought this because I think it's so telling and slightly depressing that it's 13 years on, today in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, there is actually a conference trying to get people who are directly implicated in these attacks now being drawn into and asked to come into an American-led coalition for another battle in the Middle East, which, you know, it's kind of a daunting note on this day.
It's
like the reversal.
On a loop, in a way. And I should add that actually the Saudis want to see these documents declassified as well, because now they feel like that their reputation has been tarnished for too long.
Interesting.
So it's very interesting what actually is revealed in those pages, and I think that now that 13 years ago, I wouldn't be surprised if it does sort of come to light in the next I don't know, few months or years maybe.
Right.
But it's fascinating and probably very disturbing stuff, because anybody who knows anything about American government knows that there's a lot of it. So
is that?
You
Yeah,
know.
definitely. When we come back, we'll lighten this show up a little bit. We promise. First, though, the morning news. Good morning. Thank you for joining us, staying with us. I-24 News Morning Edition on 9/11/2014. We did mark 13 years to that fateful incident and the attack on the United States, but we're going to lighten up the show a little bit. It's our last half hour, and you know what? People need to be happy and move on, because that is what life is about, and for that reason, we brought only blonde women into the studio today. So this is the Blonde Brigade. Yeah, all the men out there in the control room are very happy about that. Netta Chitov, but we're not just blonde. We're smart. We're brilliant.
Yes, and we care about the environment.
And we care about the environment.
Yes.
And that's where Netta, who's our environmentalist mama, tell me, what do you have for us today?
So we have mostly good news, but we'll start with the bad news.
Oh, great, thank you.
Okay?
Yes, I forgot.
Yes. So the CO2 has grew in the fastest rate ever since they started measuring it ever this year, and not this year, 2013.
Where, all over the world?
Yes, all over
We're
the
all
world.
suffocating?
Yes, we are suffocating.
Oh,
and it was supposed to be going down, actually, or at least, you know, to go on a plateau.
Yeah.
But no,
Yeah.
it actually grew in the fastest rate since 1984, when they started actually, you know, measuring it.
And
These
the
are
reason
not
is
good
us,
news.
isn't
Yeah,
it? Yeah.
us and China, I would say.
But primarily China.
Humans and China.
And China, wow.
And everyone, you know, that cares about it or that is involved in it in some way is very depressed these days. And the UN also set a goal to lower, you know, the temperature in 2 degrees. In 2010, they've decided that it will happen in 2050.
15 or 50?
50.
Right.
Yeah.
How are we working towards that?
Not very well,
Not so good.
actually. We have a quote of the World Meteorological Organization. This is the organization that actually measures it. Let's hear him.
Please.
For CO2, but also for methane, for other greenhouse gases, the concentration keep on increasing. And that's year after year we break new records. But this year, an important additional news is that the rate of increase of CO2 concentration is even faster than previous year. Actually, it was the fastest rate over more than 30 years. So in other words, we are not in a period where the emissions start to plateau and to diminish. Rather, they tend to increase even.
Not to make light of this, but I have to say I'm listening to him, okay? And he's so calm, and
Yeah,
he's
he's very
European,
calm.
and you know, and the
This
CO2
is the problem
rising.
they remember.
And this is you want somebody standing there
Yes.
going, you know, you people are destroying the planet.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is
Europeans.
Problems
Yes.
of environmentalists, liberals in general.
And you, no, I love you, but you're like, you're pleasant, this is really awful. Yeah, get angry, Netta. Yeah.
There are some environmentalists that are very angry and
And they're in jail.
yeah, because they hooked themselves.
And up to some ship anywhere, somewhere in Russia. Yeah.
But here's someone that is really angry. It's the court of the U.S. who decided that, who ruled that BP, the British Petroleum, was reckless, grossly negligent in the New Mexico oil spill in 2010, and they're going to pay a lot of money to the people of the states and to whoever was affected by it. And this is a really important rule.
It's good because it's a deterrence in many ways. Deterrence that maybe, you know, better take caretaking of those facilities. Okay.
Yeah, so we are happy about that.
Okay, that's slightly, you know, happy news. Yes, what else?
Okay, now cool stuff.
Cool, cool
no
stuff
bad
from
news.
now
Okay,
on. You deserve it, folks. Yeah.
Meet DJ Kevin Motivation, but Motivation.
Mo.
This is the coolest person on earth, and he's environmentalist. Let's see, maybe we have
Let's
some
take a look at him.
video clips of him.
And where is he? Momo.
Anyway, he rides a hybrid bicycle. He is a hip hop singer, and he sings about OG. OG is organic gardening.
Wow.
Yeah, he grew up in the worst neighborhood of Colorado.
Right,
5
where?
Points. Do you know
There,
it?
we have some
here
clip of
he
him.
is.
Okay.
Look at this guy. This is in a TED lecture, actually, that he's giving.
Shout out to all the 5 points. That's
Where
where I'm
is
from.
that? Yeah.
5 Points is where he grew up.
Everybody.
5 points. Oh, that's the TED.
Yeah, he's really into educating youth. He just did an Indiegogo crowdsourcing project that he will go into classes and schools and do master classes and teach them how to be cool environmentalists. And look at this bicycle at the back. This is like his symbol.
The bicycle, ride the bike down.
Yeah, and he has a really interesting manifesto. He believes that through hip hop and music in general and cool stuff, you can reach the hearts of youth and adolescent, and that's what he does. And he believes that hip hop is actually. Okay, are you ready? An acronym for Higher Inner Peace, Helping Other People. Cool guy, yeah?
I gotta tell you, I think that that you will deem him cool. I think that somewhere in 5 points there's a bunch of kids going, oh my God, what happened to you? Yes, but
and
still,
he talks about food, human rights, the environment.
I think that's fabulous. That acronym
pollution.
for hip hop I don't think is gonna fly, but
he's actually popular.
No, it's very sweet and good news. Yes.
Yes, and we're staying in the cultural, environmental, border. Victor de Souza, it's a fashion designer. He's quite famous, in the fashion industry. He decided that he's going to show his 2015 spring collection on horses, on the horses carriage in New York. The Manhattan. They wait there at the bottom of Central Park. And who, welcomed here in PETA, the biggest animal welfare organization.
The people that we love.
And then the whole debate started there between PETA, who are doing a really long campaign to stop this horse carriages tradition. And they have Mayor Bill de Blasio actually next to them. He supports stopping it. These are the models, and they are in favor of continuing it. You see, save our horses, let's continue this tradition. Let's continue riding horses in a really old-fashioned...
I cannot take somebody who looks like that seriously. And I'm not talking about the horse.
So
But will you buy
the horses
by
keeping them
they're saving the
riding
horse owners.
people? I am so confused.
This is what he wanted you to be confused and for us to talk about it.
And to use the word, when you say save the horses, then you use the word that clearly... Again, can't take somebody who looks like that seriously. First of all, eat something, will you? That's one,
models in New York,
I know. Smile, eat, and that, oh my Lord, save our horses.
Yeah, so the PETA people were all over the route, were, shouting and welcoming, and it was a whole fuss there. And so afterwards, they went into an indoor showroom and just showed.
And just showed that. I always found those horses on Central Park.
No horses
at
inside.
Least, oh my God. Yeah.
So there is a whole debate in New York whether we should stop it or not. And
I mean, it is a New York trademark, but I always found it so
depressing.
Did you know
that it's only a decade? It's not like that it used to be
there
always.
No, it's not a decade.
That's what
the carriages?
Yeah.
No. Because I'm a little bit,
So maybe they renew it a decade ago. But
yeah, maybe. I mean, I know I look 12, but I am actually 73, and that it's been around for a while.
Since you were 12.
Since I was 12. And
finally, really good news for the blue whales in California. They're actually increasing their numbers. There are 2,200 blue whales now, which is 97%. Yes,
sorry.
Exactly. Or Japan.
Or Japan.
Japan.
Yeah.
This is actually 97% of what it was estimated to be before whaling started. Since the 70s, the late 70s, there are laws that prohibit from whaling over there, and we are really happy for them, and we wish them, to live a long and happy life.
We needed it
Yes.
today. No,
Yes.
no, no. Netta, you of course are staying with us because we do not, and we never break up the Blonde Brigade. And in studio, didn't introduce you at the beginning, blonde and tan. Yes, I'm just saying.
It's the summer.
It's the summer look. Let's check this out. Our culture correspondent, contributor, Crony Stav, what do you have for me?
Well, we have some other music artists that are all about the environment, but to a whole different type of alley. So U2 released a new surprise album. It's called Songs of Innocence. It's their first album in the past 5 years, and it was a gift. It was for free for iTunes customers with love from Apple. Yeah,
I have it on my iPhone for a couple of days, and I don't know. I never downloaded
you just
it.
got it. Which
Wow.
we get to it later because people just got it on their phone. So not everyone.
They brought it out free.
So yeah, they brought it out free. It was released in the release of the new iPhone 6. U2 were performing there, and then they had all little shenanigans type of
Correct me
acts.
if I'm wrong, because I'm really at the ripe age of 73. I'm a bit senile. Didn't they launch the music technology? My God, of Apple at the beginning? Wasn't it U2? No.
No, it wasn't.
No.
But
You
in
corrected
the press,
me. I was wrong. Yes.
But in the press release of the iPhone 6 with Tim Cook, Apple's CEO, they created this little shenanigans of an act, and Bono was saying, "You have over 500 million customers. How can you get my music to everyone?" And then Tim Cook was saying, "Oh, just bring it for them for free." And then 5 seconds
boom,
later,
it's
it
in your
was
iPhone.
on everyone's iPhones, which is a little
Okay, have you listened to it?
I've listened to some of it.
How is it?
It's not bad. It's pretty good. They're saying it's the most intimate and personal album ever. Bono actually talked about it and was saying that now this album that is the most intimate could be shared with 500 million people by hitting send. And he was saying, "I wish songwriting was that easy." Yes, and
I'm sorry, I'm gonna sigh for a little bit.
No, it was a whole like how we're gonna do it. Yeah, it was a little bit of that.
Yeah, exactly.
It was just a little bit of that. But it's a very very intimate album. One of the songs, Iris, is dedicated to Bono's late mother, Iris Housen. They died when he was 14. So it's a pretty interesting album to listen to.
It's been 5 years, which is commendable. I guess if you're U2, you can wait 5 years before you come out with another album.
You can wait for 5 years, but there is a lot of not everyone's excited about it. Like you said, people just got it on their iPhone, so Twitter went crazy about the fact that people went like, "Holy moly, I have U2 on my iPhone. How did that happen?"
Did you listen to it, or did you delete it, or did it just come pop up?
No, all of a sudden it started playing. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, it's part of your shuffle,
Seriously?
so it's a little bit it's a little bit weird. But
no, that's creepy.
I don't know. It's free, so listen to it and then delete it.
That is quite creepy. Okay, and then today, other than 9/11, there is actually another.
Have you seen his daughter, by the way? Bono's daughter. She's
Sorry, I'll just sit back.
She's acting in The Nick, the new HBO series.
Okay, no,
she's very
I haven't.
beautiful and nice, and
I can imagine that she's beautiful.
I don't know.
But if she's good, I can imagine that too. She's talented. And
back to me. Okay, and back to me. Yes, but that was nice. Yes, and there is, and the other thing that you have for us.
The other thing that I have for us. So we have another present. This one is not for free. The 12 times platinum rock and roll soundtrack of Forrest Gump will be released for the first time on vinyl in North America. I know, that's exciting for everyone.
First of all, it's a great soundtrack.
It's a great soundtrack. It has so many, it's Elvis, Bob Dylan,
Alabama, something's coming down. Yeah, it's
everyone, everything. It's a 32 songs in the track. It's being split into 3 different LPs, red, white, and blue, in order to, it's very, very patriotic.
Yes.
And what you were mentioning about the fact that it's all, it's very recognizable songs.
Yes.
And the music producer, Seal, actually talked about it. And he was saying that he wanted...
Seal?
That's his last name. I will find his first name in just a minute.
No, because I thought Seal
No,
Yeah.
I will find it. Joel Seal. Joel Seal, not just Seal.
Nothing to do with
Joel
Seal.
Seal.
And he said...
And he said that they wanted the music to be very recognizable, so you can notice the timeline of Forrest Gump, what the setting is around.
As they go through the American history, which was... I remember, Sammy, you weren't born. But
I was born.
You were, we were
I was
there.
born, I swear. I swear I was born. I was born and loved
on
the
your
movie.
way to preschool.
On my way, I was saying life is a box of chocolates.
I love that movie. But that was, I remember watching it and thinking, first of all, it was remarkable because we have seen movies since that emulated the, you know, the type of story that you're going through, like Boyhood now. I think we had that chat, but that was amazing.
It made $677 million in July 1994, the year it came out. Wow. And it actually, they're doing a re-release on movie theaters as well, on IMAX. Wow. So so people can...
So it was that influential, I didn't even
Robin
know.
Wright, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, Robin Wright, Tom Hanks, it's just a phenomenal film, and now you can get it on vinyl.
Come on, I can go forever with, you know.
Pretty exciting, and it's really good. You can actually pre-order it now. It's going to be out November 4th, but pre-order it.
No, pre-order.
I mean, you have U2 already on your iPhone, so you might as well have.
As I was about to say, what was it?
Your Forrest Gump on your vinyl.
The lines that we love and remember, other than "Life is like a box of chocolate," is the least. Sorry, it's it's the list of the way you can make shrimp. You guys don't remember what I'm talking about?
Shrimp. Yeah.
Baba Shrimp.
Baba Gump.
Baba Gump. Thank you. Baba Gump.
Baba Gump. Still in Times Square.
True.
Still in Times Square.
Still in Times Square. You should not eat there.
I was about to say, don't.
Just look and say, like, Forrest Gump, and keep on walking.
Whatever
keep
you're
on
doing.
Walking. Exactly.
No, girls, I love that you were with me this morning because we lightened this very, very sad day a little bit up, and I think that's something that we have to remember. So people, because the world is such a nasty, sad place, take care of your environment, okay? And listen to good songs. I think is what we're taking out of this.
Yeah,
right?
You have U2, maybe also by the Forrest Gump.
By the Forrest Gump, Forrest
that's
Gump
a better one.
And that is it for us. 9/11/2014, the morning edition on I-24 News. Don't forget to check us out on the web, Facebook, Twitter, and please join us tomorrow morning. I think I just lost my earring. I did. Join us tomorrow morning for another edition to start your day, as you should be doing every single day. Thank you.